Well, welcome back to Catechism today. We are continuing through the Apostles' Creed. We are looking today at the statement in the Apostles' Creed that speaks about the Ascension of Jesus Christ. So we've already looked at how we believe in Jesus Christ, God's only Son. He was born of the Virgin Mary, conceived by the Holy Spirit. He suffered under Pontius Pilate. He died, was buried, he was crucified, he died, was buried. He descended into hell. On the third day, he rose again from the grave. He ascended into heaven. And we're going to look at that in a bit more detail today through the lens of the Heidelberg Catechism, Lord's Day 18. We're going to restrict ourselves just to Lord's Day 18. I considered bringing Lord's Day 19 into it because they are very, very interconnected. But today we're just going to keep it to the Ascension itself, and then the next session we'll be looking at, the session of Christ at the right hand of God the Father. So today I would like to just begin by reading a few short verses from the book of Acts. The Ascension of Jesus is recorded in greater detail and lesser detail in 3 of the 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, they all conclude their Gospels with the Ascension of Jesus. And Luke, who also writes Acts, includes the Ascension of Jesus at the beginning in chapter 1. The only Gospel that doesn't include an explicit description of the Ascension is John's Gospel. But I'd like to read with you, if you don't have a Bible, hit pause and go grab one real quick, as well as a book of praise. But I'd like to read with you from Acts chapter 1, just a few verses here, verses 6 through 11, and then we'll talk about the Ascension and what it is, what it isn't, and its significance, or part of its significance, and then we'll look at the rest of its significance next week. Luke writes there in verse 6, Acts 1, "So when they had come together," this is the disciples with Jesus, "they asked him, 'Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?' He said to them, 'It is not for you to know the times or seasons that the Father has fixed by his own authority, but you will receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth.' And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, 2 men stood by them in white robes and said, 'Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven.'" So the Ascension, Jesus leaves earth in many ways the same way as he came to earth. If you remember the Christmas story, Jesus is born in the town of Bethlehem. And outside the town of Bethlehem, there are a group of shepherds in the field watching their flocks, and it's angels who announce the arrival of the King, the Son of David. Christmas is ushered in with the announcement of a choir of angels singing praises to God. And then we go through the life of Jesus and the ministry of Jesus, and an angel shows up in the Garden of Gethsemane to strengthen Jesus for what he needs to do. And then on Easter Sunday morning, it's angels again who greet the women and some of the followers who are looking for the body of Jesus, and they can't find it. And the angels say, "He has risen, and go tell the others." And now we come to the Ascension. The Ascension of Jesus also has angels present. The Ascension of Jesus takes place 40 days after Easter Sunday. And it's one of these days, even on our church calendar, we don't often give it the same amount of attention as Christmas and Good Friday, even as the day of Pentecost. And maybe it's because it doesn't always fall on a Sunday, but it's a remarkable event in the gospel, and it's so full of good news for you and for me. The Ascension of Jesus is really his coronation. Jesus ascends into heaven. Ascend just means he goes up. And you see that he's taken up in the book of Acts. Whenever I think of the ascension, maybe it's a bit silly, but it's almost the opposite of Mary Poppins. If you've ever read or watched the first Mary Poppins movie, she just kind of comes descending down holding this umbrella. But Jesus ascends without anything. He ascends upwards and upwards and upwards, and the disciples are watching him physically leave. And then a cloud obstructs their view of him, and he's gone. And as they're gazing into the air, as we read in Acts, two men said, "What are you doing? Why are you looking? What are you waiting for?" He's gone. He's in heaven. But one day he's going to come back. But he comes to heaven, and Jesus is crowned king. That crown of thorns that he wore on Good Friday, that's not what he's crowned. He's crowned king. He's given dominion over everything. And we're going to look at the significance of that next week. But even the Old Testament looked forward to this moment. There's a couple of Psalms that we could turn to. Psalm 24, if I'm not mistaken, speaks about the coronation or the arrival of a king into the city. Psalm 68, verse 17, speaks about God being this cloud rider, and he rules over the nations. But Psalm 47 is maybe the most beautiful of these, and maybe we can just read that for a moment right now. And you'll notice when you read Psalm 47 what the emotion is. It's one of joy for God's people. It's one of singing. It's one of celebrating. And this is what it says in Psalm 47. This is looking ahead to Jesus as he ascends into heaven. "Clap your hands, all peoples. Shout to God with loud songs of joy. For the Lord, the Most High, is to be feared, a great king over all the earth. He subdued peoples under us and nations under our feet. He chose our heritage for us, the pride of Jacob whom he loves. God has gone up with a shout, the Lord with the sound of a trumpet. Sing praises to God, sing praises. Sing praises to our King, sing praises. For God is the King of all the earth. Sing praises with the psalm. God reigns over the nations. God sits on his holy throne. The princes of the people gather as the people of the God of Abraham. For the shields of the earth belong to God. He is highly exalted." You can see this is just a moment of joy. In the past sessions, when we looked at the suffering of Jesus and the crucifixion and death of Jesus, if I recall correctly, I spoke about the humiliation of Jesus, or the Son of God. He humbles himself. Philippians 2 says that the Son of God, though he was in the form of God, did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he laid aside these things. He emptied himself. He took on the form of humanity. And that's the story of Christmas. This is the humiliation of Jesus, of the Son of God, as he takes on the form of humanity in the person of Jesus, and he suffers and he dies on a cross. Well, the resurrection of Jesus on Easter Sunday begins his exaltation. And this continues his exaltation, and he ascends into heaven, and he's crowned as king. Now, what is the ascension? I already have talked about what's described in the gospel. This is good to keep in mind. This isn't just, again, if we think back to the story of Easter and how the chief priests were concerned that the disciples would steal the dead body of Jesus, tell everyone he had been raised from the dead, maybe skeptics would continue and say, yeah, and now they've said he's ascended into heaven, and they've disposed of his body somewhere, and nobody's ever found it. And nobody can ever question whether or not it's true. But we know from 1 Corinthians 15 that Jesus appeared physically to more than 500 people. He appeared to the apostles. He was there for 40 days teaching, and he was with them. And then he gives the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations. And they physically watch him, his physical form, ascend into heaven, into another place, into another dimension, and he disappears. So it's not a lie. It's not a spiritual ascension. It's a physical ascension. And Lord's Day 18 kind of gets to that point in question and answer 46. It says, well, what do you confess? What are you saying you believe when you say that he, Jesus, ascended into heaven? And here's the answer, that Christ, before the eyes of his disciples, was taken up from the earth into heaven, and that he is there for our benefit until he comes again to judge the living and the dead. Now that's what the angels said in Acts 1. He will come again. And here we read that he's going to come to judge the living and the dead. Now here's a couple of questions that would immediately follow. Well, if Jesus is gone, is he with us anymore? And Jesus spoke about this in John 14 and 15 and 16 before he was arrested. And he says, I'm going to go, but I'm not going to leave you as orphans. I'm going to send the Comforter, the Holy Spirit, and he will teach you, and he will instruct you, and he will convict the world of sin. And here we see this again in Acts 11. He says, wait in Jerusalem. I'm going to send the Spirit, and when the Spirit comes, you will be my witnesses. So that's one of the first benefits. Is Christ then not with us until the end of the earth, as he has promised? Well, he is and he isn't. Because the answer says, well, Christ is true man and true God. Now, I want you to think about this. Sometimes, even Christians that you might know seem to have this idea in their head that when Jesus ascends into heaven, he discards his body. And he's just back to what he was before the incarnation. He's just spirit again. But the humiliation of Jesus when he took on flesh wasn't so much that he took on flesh. It was that he took on human flesh, complete with all of its infirmities and weaknesses and limitations. Human flesh that was living in the world that has been cursed by sin. But at the resurrection, Jesus receives a glorified body that's not going to be subjected to any of this world's curse. He has overcome sin. And Jesus doesn't discard this body. This is what's so beautiful about the gospel. Jesus will always be fully God and fully man into eternity. And so that's what we see. Jesus is true man and true God. With respect to his human nature, his body, of course, he's no longer on earth. His body is in heaven. He's at the right hand of God the Father. But with respect to his divinity, his majesty, his grace, and his spirit, he is never absent from us. And that's why Paul can say in Galatians 2, I have been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Christ sends the Spirit. The Spirit of Christ, the book of Acts, sometimes calls the Holy Spirit. And so Jesus is never absent from us, even though he is physically in heaven. Now that brings up an important question in 48. Does that mean these are separated? And the answer again is no. But are the two natures of Christ not separated from each other if his human nature is not present with us, wherever his divinity is? And the answer is not at all. Because his divinity has no limits. He's omnipresent. So his divine nature can be in heaven, his divine nature can be here, his divine nature can be in Africa, in Australia, in Europe, on the face of the moon, wherever. His divinity has no limits, so it must follow that his divinity is indeed beyond the human nature, which he has taken on, and is nevertheless within this human nature, and remains personally united with it. His human nature is in one place, but his divine nature is everywhere, including with his human nature. And now we come to the benefits, and we're going to kind of drill into these a little bit more. How is this gospel that Jesus is in heaven? Question 49. How does Christ's ascension into heaven benefit us? Here's number one. First, he is our advocate in heaven before his Father. Now that's a beautiful thing to think about. If you think of the book of Job, how Satan comes and he appears before the Lord, and he's called the Satan, the accuser. Well, in the book of Luke, we read that Satan is thrown from heaven, and now there's no accuser in heaven. We have Jesus in heaven at the right hand of God the Father, and he's called our advocate, which is really a Latin word that means he speaks to. He speaks up for us. He's representing you and me. And so he says, Father, listen to their requests because of what I've done, because of my perfect work, because of my shed blood. Don't condemn them. Don't take your love away from them because of me. So that's the first benefit. That's amazing. The second one is this: we have our flesh in heaven as a sure pledge that he, our head, will also take us, his members, up to himself. So we can look forward to the day when Christ returns in glory. Revelation speaks about this in chapter 21, that God's dwelling place will descend onto the new heaven, or from the new heaven into the new earth. And his dwelling place will be among mankind, the redeemed. So heaven isn't going to be this disembodied spiritual existence when Jesus returns, but we will be on a physical earth with our physical bodies glorified in the presence of a physical Jesus. So that's number two. And third, we've already talked about this a little bit. He sends us his Spirit as a counter pledge. That's like a down payment, a deposit, a guarantee, by whose power we seek the things that are above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God, and not the things that are on earth. So Jesus gives us his Spirit. His Spirit works faith in our hearts. His Spirit gives us the power to live for him. Christ lives in us. And Jesus is able to pour out his Spirit on the church from heaven, where he reigns as King over all things. So that's the ascension of Jesus into heaven. And you can imagine now maybe a little bit more why his session, his seating, or his being seated at the right hand of God the Father is connected to this in Lord's Day 19. So we'll pick that up next week, and we'll speak a little bit more really about the sovereignty of Jesus over all things and the hope that we have even in this broken world. But I'll send you the questions after this, and you can do those family discussion questions together tonight as well. That's it for today. Have a great week.